dream I was a dog barking on your door. Dream you Brooke Shields hollering, come on, let's go. Oh, what a dream. What a dream I went through. You know, all through my dream now, baby, I didn't even miss you. Looking at pretty girls just as far as I can see. And who but Kim Fields waked I at me. Oh, what a dream. What a dream I went through. You know, all through my dream, baby, I didn't even miss you.
Welcome everybody to the Mini Geology Show. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist at KPFT HD2 channel from Houston, Texas. Here we are in the beautiful Montrose headquarters of our beloved radio KPFT. As you know, this is a weekly show about earth science and our beloved geology. We're going to have today here Bob Hazen. He's a mineralogist and astrobiologist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's Geophysical Laboratory. He's also professor of earth science at George Mason University and executive director of the Deep Carbon Observatory. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thanks so much, Daniel. It's great to be with you and to be on KPFT.
Bob, what is the tricks that you use to catch up with your calendar? You are such a busy professional. How do you do it?
Oh, I'll tell you, it's fun. As a geologist, you get to travel all over the world and meet interesting people. I was in Houston not long ago at Rice University, but then shortly after that was in Tokyo and then Shanghai, and soon I'll be going to the Russian Arctic. So, we do get to travel a lot and see interesting places.
Where are you now, Bob?
I'm actually at our home in Bethesda, Maryland for just a few days before the next trip. So you've caught me at a sort of relaxed interlude between two of the long trips.
So, Bob, you have such a thick history behind you that I would like yourself to define you as a professional. Who are you, Bob?
Oh my goodness, that's hard. The thing about science is it's such a creative and fun thing. It's more like jazz than like playing in a symphony orchestra. So you have to make it up as you go along. Nobody wakes up and tells you, okay, today you're going to do this. You have to sort of be creative. But if you're lucky, if you get good breaks, and if you follow up on interesting leads, sometimes life works out for a scientist. So I started out very early on as someone interested in crystals. I love minerals. I love crystals. I collected them when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. So I wanted to study them, and I had an opportunity to study with some very distinguished people in that field. And right about the time when I was interested in studying crystals, there was an invention called the diamond anvil cell. It's a tiny little device that allows you to take crystals to extremely high pressures. And no one had ever looked at the crystal structure of minerals at the kinds of high pressure that occur deep in Earth, like down in the mantle, 100 or 200 kilometers deep. So I was one of the first people to be able to use this device, and that set up my career, because if you do something new, people notice. And then I got hired to my first job at the Carnegie Institution, which was a dream job because they basically give you 12 months of salary to do whatever you want to do. And I did that for a bunch of years, and I had great graduate students and postdocs come to work with me, and I sort of thought things were cruising along. But the thing is, when you've got lots of graduates and postdocs, they tend to learn the same things you've learned, and then they tend to go to the National Science Foundation at other places and try to get money to start their own laboratories. And I was competing against these really bright students, and I said, I don't have to do that. I can do something new. So my career then started taking these twists and turns and doing different kinds of studies. So that's sort of where we're going with this, is that, when I started out as a crystallographer mineralogist more than 40 years ago, I never could have predicted where I've ended up today. And we can get to that. It's kind of a serendipitous set of stories.
So, Bob, if you look back, what do you think is the legacy, your scientific legacy that you leave to the community?
So I really love minerals. I love crystals. I love collecting them as a kid. And that always was kind of the core of what was important to me. But, you know, mineralogy has kind of gotten sleepy. It's kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of places because there's a whole group of people in the mineralogical world who have focused more and more and more on the crystals, on the minerals isolated from their historical context. You know, every time you go to a museum, every time you see a beautiful crystal of quartz or calcite or topaz or tourmaline, when you see these beautiful crystals, they have a history. They tell a story. But the mineralogists focus much, much more on the idealized chemistry, the perfect crystal structures, ignoring the kind of messiness of every natural crystal. Every crystal has defects. It has trace and minor elements that aren't part of the ideal formula. It has isotopes that may be all mixed up. It has a story. It has a past. And it's all that information, that rich sort of information in a mineral that kind of has been ignored or at least has not been treated with as much interest as I think it should be. I love storytelling. That's part of it's built into my psyche. I like to write books. I like to write stories. And so to me, I look at a mineral and I want to know its story. So if I have any legacy at all, it's to be thinking about minerals in an evolutionary context. I sort of introduced this idea called mineral evolution. And it's really caught on like a fire because I think mineralogists themselves want to tell stories. And they suddenly realize, hey, we can do this. We can do this in a new way. We can see each mineral specimen not only as a storyteller, but when you put all the minerals together, they are the ultimate storyteller of how our planet, how Earth has changed and evolved over 4 billion years of history. They have the testimony of the rock. They are the actual observers, the eyewitnesses of that planetary evolution. And so each mineral fits into that story in a way that I think is now much more powerfully coming to life. That's what I want to think of as my legacy as someone who thinks about minerals and the stories they tell.
I like storytellers. I'm also one of those in my humble position of a sedimentologist studying the outcrops and the cores. They have so much to say, these rocks that we find out in the mountains. So thanks for being a very good storyteller, Bob.
Well, it's true. The sedimentologists, the paleobiologists, the people look at fossils, the people look at this. You can't look at a sedimentary rock without seeing that there's a story. You know, there was water, there was wind, there was, layers of rock being laid down and then had to be lifted up again. It's an amazing story. That's what really led us to the understanding of deep time that James Hutton, more than 200 years ago, first kind of recognized. Gosh, when you look at the rocks and the formations, you need many, many millions of years in order to affect the kinds of changes we see in the rock. So geology is a very rich kind of storytelling in deep time, and mineralogy has been very late to the game of sort of jumping on and saying, hey, we can do that too. So we're raising our hands and going to lots of meetings now and telling stories, just like people like you have been doing for a long time.
But when you tell those stories about the mineral evolution, and this is your legacy, can you tell us where do you see your merits? What is the merit of you of creating this legacy? You may have some merits, and sometimes you may have also some luck.
Let me tell you about stories about serendipity and luck. In 1987, when I was just a crystallographer doing mineralogy, doing all this sort of, I've been doing it for a long time at that point, and was very, very good at it. And so one day I got this cold call from Houston, from the University of Houston, Paul Chu. He had just invented a new high-temperature superconductor. And he said to me, Bob, I need someone to measure the crystal structure of this, but I'm not going to send it to anybody in a physics lab because they might steal it. And he basically was telling me, I know that you know a lot about minerals, but I know you don't know anything about superconductors, so the chances of you filing a patent and scooping me are zero. And so he trusted me to do this. So I figured out the superconductor, and during the process, which was just this incredibly intense, exciting time, because there were other teams around the world trying to do this also. So in trying to determine that crystal structure, I started writing a diary. And the diary that I wrote turned into a book called The Race for the Superconductor. And that book caught the eye of some people at George Mason University who were starting a new kind of program called the Robinson Professors. These were broadly interdisciplinary people who would focus their attention on undergraduate teaching, not making big fancy graduate programs, not bringing in huge amounts of grants from government programs, teaching undergraduates. And I was really intrigued by the chance to work with a colleague named Jim Treffel, who is working on scientific literacy. That's another one of my passions. It's another one of the things I've been very, very involved in for 30 years now, is how do you basically introduce the sciences to a non-scientific audience in a way that they can use them down the road. You know, Geology 101, where you memorize the names of 100 rocks, or you know, biology or organic chemistry. You might take a course, you memorize all the vocabulary, you have nothing to build on, and you end up thinking science is dull and boring, and you're so glad you finished it. I wanted to develop a course, and Jim Treffel and I worked on this, that would make people really excited, say, for the rest of my life, I want to learn more about science because it's so interesting. And so that's what we've done, a course called Great Ideas in Science, and that brought me to George Mason. But the reason this is so serendipitous, I mean, this is kind of, these get very involved because that's what life is like. It gets complicated, it gets messy. One of my Robinson colleagues is a guy named Harold Morowitz. Harold Morowitz has been working on the origin of life, and he was really interested in possible roles of minerals in the origin of life. So we were just sitting at a Christmas party in 2006. We're sitting there on a nice white sofa. We're very carefully with our glasses of Burgundy. I didn't want to spill any. And we're talking, and the way Harold does, he talks about one thing, he talks about something else. And he always said, oh, and by the way, and when he said, oh, and by the way, you know that Harold Morowitz was going to come up with something really, really interesting, because that's how we sort of got ideas. And he said, oh, by the way, Bob, do you think there were any clay minerals in the Hadean? And that may sound like a very strange and obscure question, but my jaw dropped, because what here's this biologist asking, you know, he knew that clay minerals had been invoked in the origin of life. He knew that the origin of life probably occurred during a period of Earth history called the Hadean Eon. That's more than 4 billion years ago. But what he was asking was, well, are scientists sure that there were clay minerals around at that time in Earth history? Okay, this was a shocking question. This was a startling question, because in all the years I've been a mineralogist, in all the literature I've read over hundreds of years, I've never heard anybody ask the question, was a certain mineral present at a certain point in Earth history? The assumption, I think, had been, in my mind and everybody else's mind, of course, all the minerals were always there all the time. There was no change. It's just mineralogy is just mineralogy, because we hadn't been thinking about deep time. And it suddenly struck me, it just came over so overpowering. Obviously, that's wrong. No, there were times in Earth history when certain minerals were not present. There were times in Earth history when certain minerals first came into being. And the reason they came into being, I thought, was, well, at various points in Earth history, new physical, chemical, and ultimately biological processes took over. Now, this is a revelation. You have to understand how before 2006, before December 6, 2006, I don't think any scientist anywhere had asked a question like that, much less thought about its implications. And so for 48 hours, for just a sleepless 48 hours, I could think of nothing else. I wrote down the draft of the paper. It took me another 2 years to complete the paper, to bring in a whole group of co-authors who were specialists. But in November of 2008, the paper called Mineral Evolution appeared, and that has been just utterly transformational. So I mean, serendipity, I mean, what I worked on superconductors, which led to teaching at George Mason, which led to meeting Harold Morowitz, which led to a conversation about origin of life, which led to the idea of mineral evolution. Now, you couldn't make this stuff up.
Bob, it seems that you have seen science from A to Z, and you just told us some of the steps that bring you through serendipity, from the rise of an idea to the writing of a paper, in this case the mineral evolution. But you follow in your career the entire alphabet from A to Z, from requesting funding to manage people, data, and finance, to the final communication of the results. I would like to go with you, step by step, through the different phases of how to make science. What is the model that you use to make science?
So the first step has got to be education. And when I say education, I mean anyone who wants to become a productive, creative scientist has to be firmly grounded in mathematics, in physics, in chemistry. And those become just the ground rules. I think data science as well, understanding coding and programming, understanding statistics and analytics, kinds of visualization techniques. Those are tools that you will build on through your career. You must have those, and you must be very proficient in those. So that just becomes your working vocabulary. I think also the really creative scientists read way beyond their own science. They're voracious. So I have made discoveries in my own field because I read literature on, for example, lexical statistics. That's the statistical distribution of words in books. Because I've studied biological ecosystems and island biogeography, that is the distribution of animals and plants on different larger and smaller islands. That seems like a field that has nothing to do with mineralogy, but it turns out it has everything to do with mineralogy because the mathematics are the same. And you can go down the list. You need to basically set yourself up to see relationships that other people haven't seen. And that's the first step, because if you want to get grants, if you want to do original research, if you want to write papers, all the things you're talking about that makes a successful scientist, the first thing is you have to have this solid foundation so you're primed to have creative ideas. And it's those creative ideas that make the really successful scientists stand out from the others who just sort of copy what other people do and just kind of add a little bits and pieces to the knowledge base.
I'm really interested on how you define the key questions of your research. What does it happen in your brain when you decide that you have an important question, so important that you're going to dedicate a lot of time and effort?
Oh, Daniel, that is such an intriguing question. Here's where this idea of creativity and serendipity and sort of making it up as you go along is so important. You have to basically look at the same ideas, the same scientific landscape that other people have seen, but you either have to find a new pathway or blaze yourself forward to that precipice, to that narrow gorge that leads you to a new vista that no one else has seen before. You somehow have to have the confidence that you can explore things in a way that doesn't have to exactly match the other way people have explored. I think the most successful scientists find discoveries at interfaces. So for a long period of time, I've, for example, been doing research on mineral surfaces and how those surfaces interact with organic molecules. That's literally an interface between organic chemistry and mineralogy, two fields that normally you don't talk about at the same time. But it turns out there's really fascinating aspects that may contribute to the origin of life. So looking for the niche, finding your place in the scientific ecosystem and creating a unique niche for yourself is really important. Once you do that, people notice you. And as long as they feel you're not trying to step on their toes, but you're complementing what they're doing, then they will support, in peer review. They'll say, this person should get grant money. This person's paper should be published. We should hire this person as a colleague at our university. And is that kind of individual, I think, that stands out and makes a very, very successful career.
An implication of what you say is that scientists or researchers, they need to dedicate time to study what is that niche that belongs to them.
You have to study the niche that belongs to you, but you have to study many, many other disciplines so you can see the connections you can make. I think the most successful scientists are the ones who somehow can link their work to many, many other people and rather than saying, you should be studying what I'm studying, they say, oh, I really am interested in what you're studying. Let me tell you why my work has been influenced by you. If you can go to 25 or 50 people and say that, I really am influenced by your work, which is so fascinating, and let me tell you what I'm doing, they'll pay attention to you. I mean, it may be just a form of flattery, but it's more than that. It's because science builds on the creative work of other people, and you need to look outward. I'm always fascinated by, in a historical example, the reverence with which people hold Gregor Mendel. Now think about this. Gregor Mendel, for a period of 8 years, did some amazing experiments on pea plants. He's the guy that discovered the laws of genetics, that each parent contributes half of your genes, and some genes are dominant and some are recessive and so forth. So Mendel figured this out. So he did these experiments for 8 years. He published a paper, which may have been in a rather obscure journal. He did send out about 100 reprints, I think, historically to other prominent scientists, and so people had an opportunity to see that. But after those 8 years, he turned his attention to administering the monastic order that he was part of, and so he sort of dropped out of science. And people didn't remember his work. They didn't follow his work. He never pushed his work after that period and said, he didn't write to Charles Darwin and say, oh, I read your Origin of the Species. It's really interesting. You might be interested in my paper that relates to what you talked about. He didn't do that. And so 35 years later, 3 other groups independently discovered Mendel's laws. And it's only when they were, I guess, doing a literature search, when they were writing up the results, they said, oh, gosh, darn, here's this guy we've never heard of who 35 years ago did the exact same thing that we had to redo and reinvent because he didn't follow through. Now, I'm making a point here. I mean, in my worldview, Mendel, as creative and clever and as wonderful as the experiments were, was not ultimately that successful a scientist because he didn't influence his peers. He did not try to reach out in such a way that he said, you should really be interested in what I'm doing, and I'm really interested in what you're doing, and this will build the science. And then people would have known Mendel's laws 30 years earlier, and who knows how much farther we'd be along in terms of genetics and molecular technologies and so forth. But it was all delayed for 30 years because there was no follow-through. I'm maybe this sounds like rambling thoughts of someone, but I really feel strongly that scientists need to be, in a very positive way, self-promoters. They need to share their results with other people, and they need to constantly be looking at the way that their work influences and is influenced by other scientists. And that's how the whole scientific effort advances.
Okay, Bob, now we step back and we go at the very beginning. Once we decide what is the key question that we're going to solve. And now we have to decide what are the collaborators we're going to work with, because nowadays nobody works by himself. How do you decide the collaborators that you need to solve that question? And where do you go to find the budget that you need to do your analysis to solve that question?
So now you're talking about sociology and economics. And anybody who thinks science is divorced from those things doesn't understand science at all. Yeah, science is very much a social endeavor. Many, many science projects will have multiple authors. I've had recent papers with more than 20 authors. And I'll tell you that I've had co-authors that were great to work with, and I've had co-authors that were terrible to work with. And I have long ago resolved that I'm going to work with people who I consider are friends, people who I know I can rely on, who I know are honest, who are hardworking, who when they say they'll do something, they do it, but who are fun to be with, so that when you go to a meeting, when you have a workshop together, you go out after a long day of work and you can have a beer and you can tell stories and you respect the other person, you learn from them, and you respect them as people. So for me, that's a sociological imperative. I'm not looking for the best person in the world in a certain field. I'm looking for the person who I can work with best. And that's a somewhat different thing. And then there's the money question. yeah, science isn't cheap. I have 7 postdocs right now. They cost me roughly $100,000 a year each. I go to meetings all over the world. I have to pay travel expenses. I have to pay, page charges when we publish something. There's just lots and lots and lots of expenses. And so you have to be very creative. You have to know the funding agencies, NASA and the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. They all have big budgets, but also private foundations. I've been very, very fortunate to get funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, from the Keck Foundation, from the Templeton Foundation, and so forth. But they all have very specific interests and sort of focuses. So you have to tailor the way you explain what you're doing to each of them. If you're going to go to the Templeton Foundation, you need to have a somewhat more philosophical approach. You need to say, how does my science fit into some of the big philosophical questions, the profound questions about origins of life and the nature of planetary evolution and so forth. When you go to NASA, you need to have something that focuses on, that will at least contribute to missions, because NASA is all about missions. So when I run a NASA proposal, it always has something about how our results in the laboratory might affect a future Mars mission or a lunar mission, and so forth. So you have to be very strategic and know how much money you're asking for, which program you're asking for, who might be the reviewers. And that becomes very strategic too. And so there's a lot of tricks to playing the game of science, which allows some people to be very successful and maybe hurt some people if they don't follow those rules.
So tell us some of those tricks.
Oh, well, knowing the program officers. Each foundation has a number of program officers, and they have they make final decisions. Of course, they have to get peer reviews from a variety of people, but, some of them are going to be more disposed to one kind of research versus another kind of research. Some of them may have the incredible pressure of very limited budgets and lots of very good proposals, so you can help them out by having not quite as, cut your budget as lean as possible. Other places you don't have to worry about that. It's knowing when to get together with someone and saying, "Oh, can I just come by, to the National Science Foundation and meet with you for an afternoon and let me just show you what we're doing?" And they'll remember that. They'll remember that you've taken the time and interest to show them something. So it's a very personal, it's a very individual thing. It's another one of these aspects that's really more sociological than it is scientific, even though ultimately the scientific goals are the things you have to support. And when you write a proposal, it better be really, really sound. We're in an age of funding where, especially from the government agencies, there are many, many programs where the rate of funding may only be 1 in 10 proposals or fewer, which means you really have to stand out as having a great proposal. It's not an easy thing to write a great proposal, but they're looking for reasons to say, well, this is a proposal we're not going to fund because they made this mistake, and so you don't want to make that mistake. It's too bad. I would say 30 years ago it wasn't nearly that bad. It was more like 1 in 3 proposals got funded, and so if you had a good, solid proposal, even if there was maybe some weak point, something that you didn't argue quite well enough, if it was a good proposal, you probably get funded. Today, any weakness at all is going to be grounds to say, well, we'll put that in the do not fund pile because we have to reject 90% of everything that comes in. And that's just a reality now. It's a tough time to get a lot of funding.
I envy your students, Bob, because they are certainly going to acquire, even by osmosis, all of your experience. But what about all of the other students, researchers, and scientists? I don't think that they never had a class with a professor teaching them how to do this sociological study on the science, how to be creative to be funded, or teaching them the tricks, those couple of tricks that you told us right now. Do you think that some professors, they teach these things?
Well, the first thing I'll say is if anybody's lucky regarding my postdocs, it's me. I have had such incredible good fortune to have amazing, brilliant postdocs. You know, every one of them I think is smarter than I am, and I learned so much from them. There was a time long ago when I'd bring in postdocs and graduate students who did exactly what I did. You know, I was going to do high-pressure crystal chemistry, and they were going to do high-pressure crystal chemistry. My philosophy now is to bring in postdocs to do something different than I do, and as I say, they're just amazing. But part of my job is to nurture the next generation, these early career scientists, where every paper that they publish, every application that they make for a job is critical to their futures. And so working closely with them, they're just little tricks. I mean, I'll tell you one trick that it just amazes me that every mentor doesn't tell their graduate students. If you're going to a job interview at a university for a faculty position, go to the website, find out who all the faculty members are, what they do, and when you're giving your job talk, just intersperse, oh, I'd love to work with Professor so-and-so in this aspect because I'm so interested in her work in the sedimentology of basins of a certain type. And I'd love to work with Professor so-and-so because he's got a isotope mass spectrometer that would be perfect for measuring the kinds of things that we could collaborate together. If you just say those things in passing, the people who are sitting in the audience, they hear a dozen seminars. But if you mention their name, if you say, I'd like to work with them, what do you think they're going to think? Oh, I don't like this guy? No, they're going to say, this person is great. This person has done his homework or her homework. This person is someone who's interested in my work. It's the simplest thing in the world to do in the job interview talk. Even put their pictures up. Put a picture of the paper that they wrote, the title page of the paper that they wrote that you're referring to. And they're going to be flattered that you recognize that. It may not get you a job, but it can't ever hurt. And it shows that you're thinking more broadly and that you want to be a team player in that department. That is a simple thing.
Yeah, I agree. It's a simple thing, and it's amazing that the professors, they don't teach that. I remember I read when I was studying late in Italy, and Cicero in his writings, he called it the captatio benevolentiae, and that was the way to start your talk. Whoever was your audience, you had to do the captatio benevolentiae. You had to capture their attention, kind of demonstrating that you knew them and that you appreciate them.
So basic, Daniel. I'll tell you that's really that's good advice. I have to say, more and more I'm hearing about departments that hold regular seminars. How to give an interview, how to write a grant proposal, how to get your paper published in Science and Nature, how to do a press interview like the one we're doing right now. Just giving people who are starting out their careers the ammunition they need because while some of this may seem like common sense, I didn't know this stuff when I started out, and I made mistakes, and I had to learn as I went along. The more you can pass the knowledge you have to your next generation, the easier their careers are going to be.
So, Bob, now moving into the step-by-step of making science, once we have the key question, we understand our collaborators, and we decide how to write the proposal properly. What do you think about the data? You certainly need data when you're going to try to answer a scientific question. How much is the effort to retrieve old data versus the effort of acquiring new data?
Boy, you've asked a question that is so square in what we're doing right now. I've changed my career in the last few years to really data-driven discovery. Yeah, I could spend my whole life collecting mineral data, and I might get a few hundred or a few thousand data points. But there are millions of data points out there. So I'm working with colleagues at the University of Arizona and in an organization called MinDat.org, and at Lamont, that's Columbia University's EarthChem database, and at Wisconsin, the paleobiological database. We're building and building and building databases, and then we're using those to understand deep time. And this whole new effort, which has actually got the nickname 4D, for Deep Time Data-Driven Discovery. And the idea is that we build big data resources and we interrogate them with the age factor, whether it's a fossil or a rock or a mineral or even certain kinds of biological activities. We can put all those on a timeline, and we can understand Earth history in this much more vivid way with lots and lots of data. You can't do it with just a few data points. You need vast amounts of data points. So that's really an important part of moving forward into scientific discovery in all fields. You know, people talk about big data. That's important, and you hear about big data in medicine and big data in economics and in corporations like Facebook and Amazon and so forth. But in geology, we have to be thinking about actually what is a real frontier in data science, and that's mid-sized or even small data, where in some domains, like in sedimentology for a certain area, you may only have 1,000 or 10,000 data points. Not big data, but enough that there may be patterns that you can deduce with new kinds of mathematics, where you use estimation techniques, not the sort of strict analytical functions that can be applied to much, much larger data sets. So this is a frontier, and it's very important in earth science. It's important in mineralogy. So I'm really, really excited about data science, and that has been all the people who come to work with me now are coders and have some discipline or domain specialty that relates to deep time.
And what about the in this decades where technology has advanced in incredible velocity? When you do your research, is it mainly driven by this technology that provides you new tools to investigate new methods, or is more driven by the ideas? Because I remember that when I started studying in the late 90s and 2000s, we had new technology that was almost so attractive, was almost magnetic. We had to use it. Once we use it, we acquire new data, we see the new data, and then we have new ideas because of those new technologies. But previously, especially in the field of stratigraphy or sedimentology, you had ideas, especially like 2 centuries ago. Like the very last idea about stratigraphy that still stays strong is sequence stratigraphy. That is just an idea. And then because you have that idea, then you try to develop technology to support it or to understand it even more or to test it. What do you think about this?
So I think you've got it right that there's two sides to this, and they're both important. You can't have one without the other. The ideas are critically important, and I think really original ideas in science don't come along all the time, but they can have a huge influence on the way we see our world, the way we see the origin and evolution and predict the future. But once you have those ideas, those creative thoughts, you need to back it up with data. And as you suggest, we have many, many more ways now. We can look at much finer scales, at the atomic scale, at the isotopic scale of systems, in the ways that we never could before. There are microscopes now that can image individual atoms. So that's amazing. We also, of course, have telescopes that look farther into space than we've ever been able to see before. So we're basically expanding our horizons. We're looking at finer scale in more detail. We're able to measure new aspects of the natural world in biology, the way we can now do single-cell genomics, and the way we can study complex communities like the gut microbiome, where you're looking at these whole community of microbes at the same time. And this is the things we can do today that we couldn't do 10 or 20 years ago are astonishing. And many of them produce vast amounts of data, once again, where we need to have the technology, not just to collect the data, but also the technology to to analyze and process the data, to explore higher dimensional aspects of the natural world, getting away from X, Y plots. That's something I constantly am preaching these days, that we look at a natural system, minerals, where there are maybe 50 or 60 different trace and minor elements in any mineral grain that you look at. You don't want to throw that data away. You want to analyze it all at once. And so you need higher dimensional analytical and visualization capabilities so that we can look at all those 50 compositional dimensions at the same time. So really, there's, this is the ideas drive the technology drives the ideas. It's real synergy.
What about in your case? Is it more technology that drives the ideas, or vice versa?
Well, for me, it's interesting. I think I get back to basics. What I have tried to do, and I think what may be considered original about the ideas that I've put forward about mineralogy, is something very simple and something very human. And it gets back to storytelling. That each mineral has a story to tell. The stories are preserved in the information-rich character of minerals. Each mineral having 50 or 60 chemical elements, trace, minor, having many more than that, isotopes, 100 or more different kinds of isotopes that are mixed together. It has defects, structural defects, it has inclusions, fluid inclusions and solid inclusions. There's tiny little specks that are inside each crystal. So it's all those imperfections, the things that are not ideal, that are information. And so in an information age, you collect every bit of information you can, and you analyze all the information at once. You don't throw away information. So to me, it's the very simple, basic human urge to tell stories, at the same time driven by the fact that we can analyze things and visualize data in ways that were never possible before. So it's kind of the old and the new merged together, and I think I really love that. I love this idea that as humans, we're part of a tradition that goes back, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, storytelling, telling our story, understanding where we came from, why we're here, what is our future going to be. But you can't do that without the rich stories that are preserved on our planet, and nothing preserves those stories better than the minerals that are all around us.
So in this story that we are telling together now, the step-by-step of making science, let's say that we arrive at a point where we have the data, we have what we would call the results in a paper, and we move into the discussion. How much time and efforts do you take to read the previous work, the bibliography, the references, reading them and citing them and understanding that there's a lot of people that they thought about that thing a long time ago?
Oh my, I'm just now in the last stages of a paper I'm writing on the minerals that form, believe it or not, around stars. The very first minerals in the cosmos were stardust. So you have an energetic star, a star that is in its late stages, and it's violently throwing off the matter through solar flares and very aggressive solar winds that are blasting outward. And the dust that's produced contains 20 or more kinds of mineral grains. So I'm writing a summary of this, putting this in the context of a system of mineralogy that thinks about the evolution of minerals over billions of years of history. And I've read literally 200 articles by other colleagues that study individual stardust. Now, most of those papers are highly technical. They go in exquisite. Some papers, you might have a 20-page paper that is talking about a single microscopic grain, much too small to be seen with the unaided eye, but it might be a perfect example of a little bit of stardust. Maybe a grain of corundum, that's the same mineral that can form rubies and sapphires, maybe a tiny diamond, maybe something that's like a silicon carbide. And each of those individual papers gives the story of one grain. What I'm trying to do is now take all of those stories and tell a story about how stars and mineralogy co-evolved. So you can't do that without reading the literature. So reading the literature is a huge part. So that's more of a review paper even, because me personally, I'm not doing any of the work on any of those individual stardust grains. I'm reading previous work and putting it in, I'm framing it in a whole new way that synthesizes the work of all of these other really amazing scientists.
What about when you do your research, you get your results, and you work in the lab, so you have your lab results, and you find that the results, they don't really help your idea?
Oh, well, there's a number of different ways. Sometimes you can say an idea, a result doesn't help your idea, but sometimes it's those anomalies that lead to the most profound discoveries. I'll give you one example relating back to the idea of the superconductors. Remember I mentioned that the University of Houston professor Paul Chu discovered a high-temperature superconductor back in 1987, and it was the first time there was a superconductor that worked at liquid nitrogen temperature, 77 Kelvin. So this was something that you could actually work in the laboratory very cheaply and easily. It turns out that a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks before Paul Chu made his discovery in Houston, there was a researcher at Brookhaven National Laboratory that found the same thing. He found superconductivity at 77 Kelvin. He wrote in his notebook, "Ha, I found a superconductor at 77 Kelvin." He assumed that he had a short circuit, that is, that the superconductivity was just two wires touching, and he disregarded his results. He could have been the one who made that discovery. But he ignored the thing that didn't fit his expectations, and so he missed it. So sometimes a result is just because your ideas are wrong, your hypothesis is wrong, and you need to start over. But sometimes that odd result is the one that leads you in the new fruitful direction where you suddenly say, aha, now I see a pattern that I never saw before. So it's a really, sometimes those anomalies, those things that don't work out so well are really exciting. And other times you just have to say, well, okay, that experiment didn't work, and you just have to go a different direction.
Bob, what about when you arrive at the final line, you understand that there's something important to be communicated, and this is the time for publication? When is the right time for publication, and where do you go and publish what you find?
We talk about this question of when to publish all the time, because especially think about an early career scientist. You can get a few data points and a few more data points. You're never finished. You're never done. There's never an end point where you say, I've done everything I can possibly do, but you have to write papers to stay alive. There's even a book called How Experiments End by an author named Gallison, a historian of science, because this is a big question in science. You have to publish, which means you need to keep papers churning out, but it may be that no one experiment is going to resolve the big question you have. So you wait to do 100 experiments and you don't publish until then? No, you can't do that. So you publish incrementally. And I do think most of the science you see, indeed most of the press releases that you see about science, are not fundamentally new things. They are just incremental advances. Oh, I found another dinosaur. We found a few more extrasolar planets. It's not the end point of any of these discoveries. It's just that you have to periodically report out what you found so far. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that it's really important to keep up the momentum, and each time you take the time to write up something, you challenge yourself, do I have enough here to tell a story? Because I think the scientific paper is we're talking about storytelling. A scientific article is in essence an extremely clean way of storytelling. You start out, you have an introduction, that's sort of the preamble to a story. Then you say, what did I do? How did I do it? What does it mean? And it's like a journey. You're taking the reader through a journey of your experiment. And if it's satisfying, you've set up a tempting goal for that journey. You explain how you went through that journey, maybe with struggles and trials and tribulations along the way, maybe with great successes and things that were unexpected that happened, and then you come up with the conclusion, hey, it was a great journey, and here's what we've learned by taking it. And now here's where we want to go from here, because most scientific papers will say, we're not done yet. We still have other things to do.
You say you need to write papers to stay alive. You just said that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it seems that there are like 2 or 3 feet of a pile of paper per day of scientific papers published. So do you think that they are all necessary?
Well, necessary. Yeah, I think they are, because I think each of the paper that gets published, it goes through peer review. It may be down the road, some of them are found to be faulty or flawed in some ways, but they've all basically been someone's effort, some group of people's effort to understand some piece of our natural world. And if a group of my fellow scientists, colleagues, human beings have discovered something they think is a piece of the natural world that they can then share with other people, you put it out there. Maybe it will suddenly turn out to be a pivot point for someone else. Maybe it will change the course of the scientific endeavor. Maybe it'll be a paper that's never cited and forgotten. Those
exactly.
are all things that happen.
So what does it happen with those papers that, and there should be a certain percentage of the papers that will be forgotten forever, or probably never read, or read probably that 2 or 3 people?
Yes, of course. There are papers that do not make the kind of major advance, but I think collectively you can't really be sure. And it's, for example, hiring colleagues at your company or your university. You do your best to get every single person that you hire to be great. Accepting students for enrollment at Rice University. You want every student to be wonderful and every student to excel. And that's when you start out with that expectation. But some students are going to do better than others. Some papers are going to do better than others. Some faculty members will do better than others. We can't be sure in advance which ones are which. If we knew for sure, if there's a quantitative way of doing it, maybe we'd be even more successful. But I just don't think there is. It's a human endeavor. And in human endeavors, you give everybody who has met a certain level, you give them a chance, and then you let the historical process of scientific discovery winnow out the things that are truly exceptional and the things that just are kind of way markers in the history of science.
And what about the goal of publishing and the goal of trying to resolve an important key question? Is it okay just for the entire community to answer key scientific questions about basic science? Or do we need also to have a part of it, or all of it, or none of it, to apply and show to the society how it is applicable, what they do?
I feel passionately that scientists, not every scientist, but some scientists need to communicate to a wider audience what we do, how we do it, what's important, a personal view of what's taking next. So, for example, for the last 10 years, I've been involved in a very large scientific endeavor called the Deep Carbon Observatory. We got generous funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and then many, many other funding agencies, a total of something approaching $1 billion in funding. We have 1,200 scientists. We are in 54 countries. And so I felt this was a really important endeavor. Many, many people working on very specific aspects of the carbon cycle on Earth, on diamonds, on volcanoes, in deep microscopic life, in carbon in the core, in deep fluids, all different kinds of aspects. And so I said, I'm the executive director of this whole thing. I need to step back and think about what it all means. So I wrote a book for a general audience. It just came out. It's called Symphony in C, C being the symbol for carbon, and it's the evolution of almost everything. And it's about carbon, and it's the synthesis. So it features the works of many, many scientists and tries to tie it together in a coherent story that is not about any one scientist, but it steps back and sees a much bigger picture. And I think that for the public at large, this is a very, very important task of the scientific community. It's not writing original papers. It's not collecting data. It's synthesizing and seeing a bigger picture and saying, what does it mean? What does it mean? Why should we care? Why should we be funding this? Why should, this be something that a teacher, an educator, or a politician, or an economist, or a business person, why should they read this book? Why should they know about this science? And that really is one of the things, because science pervades all of our lives all the time. Everything we do in our world, well, it's not, science is certainly by no means the only thing, even in scientists' lives. I mentioned sociology, I mentioned economics, and there's many other things as well. But the scientific findings really do influence our lives in profound ways, and that needs to be shared with a wider audience.
So I guess that when you reach this level of maturity where you can write a book, Symphony in C, about the entire understanding of the sea, the carbon, for people that are not scientists, you maybe have reached a respectable plateau in the things that you do, that it's time to move on to another topic. What do you think about that?
Oh, I do. I think it's time to move on. I'm going to be moving on from carbon, and I know my next 10 years of work, I have it all spelled out if I'm lucky enough to be productive for the next 10 years. I'll be doing an entirely new organization of the world of mineralogy and telling that story, the cosmic story of mineralogy from its most ancient origins more than 13 billion years ago, right up to the present day when humans themselves are creating vast amounts of mineral-like materials that are going to transform the surface of our world and will be forever. Even if all humans die out in the next 10,000 years, it will be a geological layer that's marked literally in stone because of the human production of mineral-like materials. So this is an ongoing story, the story of Earth and the story of the evolution of minerals.
It's so exciting what you just said, Bob, that I have to tell you, please, if you need help, call us. If you need anything, call us. If you need to use the radio as a megaphone, here we are. And it's so amazing to feel and perceive from here, from the radio waves, the passion that you have and the will to interconnect different people from different disciplines at different levels. That is really something almost tangible in here, in the studio where I am. So thank you, Bob, really. And also, I would like to give you a couple of minutes with a completely open mic if you want to express yourself and say things that you didn't have the opportunity to say. Bob Hazen, a mineralogist and astrobiologist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's Geophysical Laboratory. The mic is yours.
Daniel, I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you and to share these thoughts with your listeners at KPFT. I think they're very, very lucky to have you in a program like yours, which provides a much more expansive way of thinking about and talking with scientists who are in the field. So thanks so much for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bob. So this was Mini Geology radio show at KPFT HD2 channel. This is Daniel Minizini in conversation with Bob Hazen. Thank you very much, and I hope to have you back next week.
Dream I was a dog barking on your door. Dream you Brooke Shields hollering, come on, let's go. Oh, what a dream. What a dream when I went through. You know, all through my dream now, baby, I didn't even miss you. looking at pretty girls just as far as I can see. And who but Kim Fields wake I and me? Oh, what a dream! What a dream I went through. You know, all through my dreams, baby, I didn't even miss you.